Thanks, Matt, for having me do this talk on an intro to web API testing. And what we're really going to be going over is we're going to do a quick who am I, just so for the folks who may not know who I am. We're going to go over what this presentation and what this topic really is going to go over, what it is and what it is not, right? We're going to cover some of the various APIs we're going to run into when we're doing web app assessments. And ultimately, I'm a big believer in understanding the fundamentals before you can go into the more advanced attacks, right? The various APIs we're going to see, and really this covers the 90%, right? You're going to see a lot of SOAP, REST, and WebSockets. And a lot of people have that debate on that third one regarding WebSockets, but I'm going to tell you some war stories of actually all three of these where I've ran into them into the wild, where I've found some really significant and interesting findings. And obviously with these types of talks, the names have been redacted to the point where unless you know the exact scenario I'm talking about, you're not going to be able to allude to who it was. And finally, I'm going to give you some pointers on places to go to advance your knowledge in API security and also general web app security as well. So the quick who am I? I'm a security professional. I've been focusing on offensive security the last, what industries? I did some government work in the beginning, some telco. I've been in the financial services space. I've done non-profit as well. If you go back and look me up on LinkedIn, I'm really not that hard to find. It's like the easy level OSINT challenge to find me. And I've got various alphabet soup after my name, but that really doesn't allude to the experience I have and the background of testing I've done. I'm a dad, I'm a husband, and you can see, in the little bottom right-hand corner, I'm also a hacker based on this conversation. In the various hobbies I've done, I do a lot of drone flying, and you can actually see a shot of me. I'm in where that little red arrow points down. That's the little base station I'm at, as we're taking the shot over the lake. Love lockpicking, and people that know me know I've got the worst jokes. The bad dad jokes, that's me, 100%. So what this presentation is, we're going to cover a whole bunch of the fundamentals on web services. What you're going to see, the 90%, how they're used, where you're going to see them in the wild. Because ultimately, if you can see them, you can understand how they work, you can go ahead and start attacking them. Sorry about that, headphone dropped out. And what it's not though, I'm not going to cover, anything crazy such as like some brand new, crazy, complicated attack. We're not going to be going into like XPath attacks or external entities injection. That's not really what this talk is. I can do that another time, but really I want to make sure we cover the fundamentals and the basics before we move on. Anyone got any questions before we dive in deeper?
Nope, go crazy.
So why should you care? And I always go back to why before going into how to do something and, looking deeper. And the reality is APIs and web APIs are all over the place. You're going to see a lot of modern web apps, a lot of modern frameworks using APIs. Mobile apps, hands down, it's a beautiful and wonderful attack vector to go after them. IoT devices, I know it's the big buzzword. Someone's going to hit bingo in a second. They use APIs to communicate on the back end all the time. And a lot of B2B, a lot of business to business app communications still happen at this layer. The reason developers often don't consider this an attack surface is because attackers, by default have just looked at this and they see port 80 and 443, they do their default checks and they move on. But if you're doing an external assessment and you see a web service open to you, it behooves you to start digging into it, because an attacker is not going to look at it and move on and say, I don't care about that, because ultimately these web services, tons of data. That you can go back to a lot of significant hacks that have happened, and you can start digging into some of the bigger ones where the developers just didn't believe this was an attack service. and seeing how they can exfiltrate data through these web services calls, it's amazing. Microservices, and I know this is another one that people kind of hear like microservice architecture. What the hell is that? And really, ultimately, fundamentally, it's moving away from the whole monolithic model, meaning Java, that big application server. And what we found is, especially moving into cloud technologies, organizations were able to distill and simplify these functions into a lot more micro architecture, meaning single function application and functions that they could move on to smaller servers. Now, what's the importance of that? All of these servers talk to one another via web services tiers. So as organizations are moving to the cloud and organizations are moving to these microservices architectures, these APIs become more and more prevalent. And once again, lots of data, lots of areas to abuse. So going back to that topic, there's 3 of them, but the one that's most known historically is SOAP. And fundamentally what it stands for is the simple XML object. It's been around since 1998 and it's still used today. You see it all over the place. And these are actually seen more in those monolithic app servers. Whenever you talk to developers, whenever you want to interface with these SOAP endpoints, which is what they're called, you're going to ask for what's called a WSDL. It's the Web Services Description Language. It's really the definition of the API. And taking a step back, an API is really fundamentally how a computer talks to another computer over the internet. So with these WSDL files, they're easily human readable, but I've seen organizations where they give me the WSDL file, but they don't necessarily modify it. It's an XML file, and they don't necessarily modify the endpoints within the XML file. And ultimately, what you're going to use this for is interacting with the backend web service, the service that you're going to be targeting. Now, what I've seen, and I've seen this all over the place, application servers, these monolithic application services where you find these WSDL or these web services for SOAP have the WSDL being published when you do a $WSDL in the URL. And in doing so, it pulls back the entire WSDL file. And what's the usefulness of this is it gives you the entire attack surface that you're going to look for. Now, the authentication from this, fundamentally, it does use basic auth, and I've seen a lot of apps still using basic auth to this day. But historically, since a lot of this is doing more business-to-business and server-to-server authentication, you are going to see a lot more client cert using digital certificates that are signed by CAs with a proper PKI. And believe it or not, a lot of these endpoints may not have any auth involved. So what does it look like? Over on the left-hand side, you're going to see what really is a fundamentally simple SOAP object. You're going to have a SOAP envelope, you're going to see a SOAP header and a SOAP body. It's not that complicated. It's not that elaborate. But the important thing to realize and recognize is when you see that, you've got to be thinking, okay, what can I do? What can I go after now? You're going to see it a lot more in thick client applications. You will see it in some mobile apps, but not a lot. The de facto tool for using and interacting with SOAP is going to be a tool called SOAP UI from a company called SmartBear. It's free. It's a developer tool, a QA tool, but all you really need to do is feed in the WSDL file directly into the tool WSDL backend. The beautiful thing about it is it's really straightforward to interact with, and the WSDL file will determine the type of authentication the backend is going to be expecting. So for example, if there's an authorization string it's going to be looking for, the WSDL is going to tell you that as you're going through it. The big thing and the most important thing of what I really think about when I'm going and doing API testing is, what am I looking for? What am I going to test? What am I going after? And before diving into trying to break an application, you've got to first see what normal looks like. And that means interacting with the web service as if it was normal, looking for authorization issues, and authentication issues outside of authorization issues too are something you need to dive into in particular. Now, that can also mean data exposure and fuzzing, and SQL map and SQL injection still works beautifully with SOAP backends. So going back to this one, and it was an external assessment where the organization I was with had done this review for this organization about year. They got basically, beautiful. Everything was great. Everything was green. You guys are doing amazing. And I came into the organization and I was given this project, and they basically said, you've got 8 hours, go ahead and conduct this external. We're not expecting you to find anything. It was just 3 APIs and have at it. So I go ahead and start assessing it. Nessus found nothing. It showed me I had, I think it was 2 of the servers were up and responding on 80 and 443. Everything else was closed. Everything was fully patched. And I was looking at it going, okay, nothing from an external perspective. I start running Durbuster on it, and boom, I get some of the URLs, but I get one of them that pops up with a login prompt. So I'm like, okay, I've got something here. Let me go ahead and start trying to see if I can brute force to see if there's any kind of ability to log in. What I did find interesting in this login prompt, though, was there was a language selection drop down where I could see various languages, so they could do encoding for example, if I want to change it to Chinese, various different types of encodings. Like, okay, interesting, not a lot here. Digging a little bit more, and out of this 8 hours, I'm probably 2 hours in where I found everything. I've done the scans, and now I'm looking, going, okay, I've got a whole bunch more time. How am I going to give value to this client? I keep on running more enumeration, and finally, I see the telltale sign that there's a web service on the back end behind the test URL that I was looking at. So I go ahead and just go ahead and put in the question mark WSDL, and I see about, I want to say about 100 different endpoints that came out for this web service. I'm like starting to go through them. More than half of them have authorization. Keep on going. One of them just stood out to me that was just like shocking, and it said save language file. I'm like, no, it can't be. And the parameters were a name of a file and also a base64 encoded message blob in it. So I go ahead and in SOAP UI, I send the message across and go back to that login screen and see the new dropdown, and I see my file listed there. I'm like, no way. I realize now that I can also then go directly to that path of that file and also include various types of files. So at this point, I'm 3 hours in, 4 hours in, going, okay, maybe I've got something juicy and something interesting. I'm able at this point to load up a full-blown JSP, get a shell through SOAP, and go back in and actually go through RCE to the actual servers internally at this point, because externally they had nothing, but internally they were in scope. I could go ahead and move laterally around through them, and actually through that engagement, we were able to get all the way through DA and go through that process, going through that first SOAP interaction there. So hopefully that painted that story of why you should be looking at SOAP a little closer sometimes, and why you need to dive into those scenarios, because we were able to demonstrate a whole lot of value just from that one external. That should have been, from the client's minds and some of my peers when I was working with it, I wasn't going to find anything. Any questions before I move on to REST?
Nope.
So REST, what you see outside of SOAP, and you're going to see a lot more in web API frameworks, a lot more of the frameworks that you're going to see. So Django, Node.js, you're going to see a lot of .NET applications using REST on the back end. You're going to hear them called single web pages or dynamic web pages. They're very, very easy to develop, which ultimately, in my opinion, gives the PHP effect. Historically, PHP was a wonderfully targeted language for various reasons, but it was also targeted because it was so easy to develop, and people without development experience were pushing out applications that they didn't understand the full implications of it. So a lot of interesting attack and a lot of wonderful attack surfaces developed in PHP, but really the focus of this is talking about REST at this point. What you do see with REST as compared to SOAP, it's interacting with a lot of the more HT verbs that you don't see quite often. So normally you see the GET and the POST request when you're dealing with web applications. But you're going to also see in a lot of REST frameworks usage of the put and the delete commands that may throw you off when you look at it and go, wait a minute, that shouldn't do this. But they've redefined it within the actual framework to go ahead and allow to do all those wonderful and additional functions within REST. Now, when you're working with developers and you want to go ahead and assess their applications, you're going to want to ask for what are called Swagger and Postman collections. It's similar to WSDL, but what ends up happening is these are used to define that framework to interact with that backend. Now, as with SOAP-based web app, or excuse me, API assessments, you're going to want to figure out what that normal is. And the interesting thing with REST in particular is that you can actually do a lot more black box testing with SOAP because you're going to see your ability to proxy the communication back and forward in between the client and the server with REST communication being a lot easier. Unlike SOAP, you're going to see a little bit more modern authentication schemes. So in this case, JWT, which are JSON web tokens, are going to be used. Once again, and I heavily stress this, whenever you see a JWT, it's just a base 64 encoded blob. You should definitely decode it right away and see what's on the inside of it, because I've seen more than one organization try to re-engineer a JWT when they should have just gone through the actual spec and validated the spec. Now, you'll see JWTs even used in web apps for authentication, but when you're looking in a REST-based API, you're going to be looking a little bit more at if the signatures are being honored within that JWT token. And that could be its own hour, day-long conversation of just attacking JWT. So point being, authentication is different compared to SOAP, but you need to go ahead and make sure that request is being sent back to the backend. So with REST, it's, believe it or not, SOAP UI from SmartBear, still that tool to use, right? It says SOAP UI, but they do REST and actually do really well. The Swagger files can be ingested directly into the SOAP UI tool to go ahead and build out those endpoints that you're going to be interacting with. When you're using the communication for REST, you want to go ahead and still find, again, that normal, right? And that means, finding that attack surface and using the same way you would do a web app assessment, interacting and figuring out what normal looks like. That could be looking at the parameters, looking at, how the application normally works before trying to attack it for various types of issues. Now, the attack's very similar to SOAP, believe it or not, and SQL Map still works beautifully with both REST but with SOAP-based web services. So the things that you want to dive into, again, with those JWT tokens, I highly stress it because I've seen the ability to do impersonation with JWT. I've seen sensitive data pass with JWT. And I've seen signatures, which is the building block of how the Java or the JSON web token works, just being completely ignored. So you can actually set within the JSON web token the signature to none. And if the server is misconfigured, it will go ahead and take that token and let you go ahead and have that authorization. So once again, you really need to make sure as you're going through the process of evaluating an API to check and see the signature of the JWT is correct. Now, the war story here regarding REST APIs. I was working, once again, it starts off with, was working on this web application, and it was a storefront application where we were going through and evaluating how the organization did the configuration for their payments, and they went through the process of pricing and whatnot for all the products they were selling. So it was a multi-storefront, multi-tenant environment, and what we found were the API calls that were used to set the pricing, and we were given a model environment that was an electronics store that had TVs, that had stereos and whatnot. We can go ahead and set the price to, $99 or $100 store. But what we found was the API was misconfigured and allowed us to break the multi-tenancy and set the prices for any other store that was in that same server on the back end. So we went ahead and started setting the prices for, I think it was a grocery store that was also on there. And we set the loaf of bread to $1,000. And they also had bottles of wine, which just set for 99 cents. Granted, this was a development test environment, and the back-end organization was like, whoa, you shouldn't be able to do that. Well, they misconfigured their authorization on the back end of the REST API. On the front end of the web API, on the web end, you couldn't do all of this. But on the API end, they weren't authorizing the credential that were being used to actually post the settings. So it was a fun one, and the client was super happy that we found it before anyone else did, and we were able to show a lot of value as we were doing just this API end test. And finally, the last one, and when people think web services, they always think SOAP and they always think REST, and they completely forget about WebSockets. And I was on that boat for quite a while, because I'm like, WebSockets, it's not being used as much. And this was, granted, a couple years back. It was an RFC back in 2011, and really the big differences between REST and SOAP and also WebSockets, both REST and SOAP are stateless. They're more web-based. They're looking at authorization that you'd find in traditional web applications, versus WebSockets, which are stateful. It's a binary communication that goes very, very different compared to the other two technologies. It's also very, very fast. It's very, very lightweight, which makes it incredibly useful for IoT devices. And beyond that, from an adversarial perspective, a lot of IDSs and IPSs just don't even look at it. It just passes right past it. So if you looked, under the curtains for the Merlin C2, it's built on WebSockets, because they could see that a lot of IDSs just ignored it, and boom, it was an easy way to go. And also the latency was incredibly low. For testing it, if you're familiar with Burp, you're going to go ahead and see that if you look at this tab under proxy WebSockets history, you're going to have the ability to actually see the WebSockets communication. And you can actually manipulate the messages within Burp. Now, going back to that point I made, that it is a stateful session, you need to be very cognizant of how fast you go ahead and send that communication over to intruder or repeater, and being able to manipulate that message. Because if you wait too long, your message is going to go ahead and get basically dropped by the server, because the socket's basically closed on the server by the time you may have gone around to send it. I've talked to a lot of professionals that when I bring them up, ask them the question, have you looked into WebSockets? Have you seen if the IoT device is communicating on WebSockets? They kind of blink at me twice and say, what do you mean WebSockets? So it's one of those ones where you definitely need to take a look at, and especially when you're working with IoT devices, it's one of those ones where the servers, especially going back to a lot of the larger organizations like Azure and even to Amazon, they are using WebSockets just because it is a much lighter weight protocol, and it is a lot faster. So how to test it, because it is going to be different, especially when you're working with mobile apps. You're going to want to point your mobile app as an invisible proxy over to Burp. And Burp, you've got to manipulate the settings within Burp and the proxy listeners to actually do invisible proxy. So you do need to set that setting, that little button right there. And you're going to want to point your system proxy for either your Android or your mobile device if you're doing mobile testing for this, because that's where you're going to see it quite often, directly at your Burp proxy. So setting it up as a network proxy on your testing network to go ahead and point at that. Now, keep that in mind. You just don't want to do this in a large corporate environment, or organizations are just going to start using you as a proxy. And trust me, I've actually done that to other people before. It's like, why do you have your proxy open to everyone? Like, it's on the private network. It's not that private. Or stateful attacks, very easy to do against this. And going back to that mindset and that model that developers aren't considering this is a viable attack surface, they do not put a lot of restrictions on this. So doing attacks with Burp against Intruder and Burp against WebSockets, it's a gold mine. Once again, the types of attacks, leaking of data, hands down, wonderful attack. Going even back to SOAP and REST, you're going to see a lot of applications when they're doing API testing. They're going to be sending sometimes a lot more data than then needs to be consumed by the end server, or excuse me, the end user. So they're expecting the presentation tier to go ahead and restrict and limit that data down, and they're not expecting the end user to be able to see, the extra data that's being sent back to the client. Before I go into the last story, any questions on REST, SOAP, or WebSockets?
I have a question, but it might be a little bit odd. So you're familiar with my company's processes, and I'm curious because you mentioned earlier in a war story about doing something on an external, and I'm kind of curious as to how you would gauge checking something out and still calling it an external versus a full-on API test. Where's the delineation line on that one?
So great question. And ultimately, when I look at an external, it's in that verge of being completely black box. So if the real true difference between what I'd call an API test, where an organization is going to be giving credentials, they may be giving full-blown source code, they may be divulging what that WSDL is going to be. In that war story, the organization, nothing was given but just a number of APIs. And that may go down the line of, for example, if an organization has an endpoint that is an endpoint for a mobile app, to truly exercise that target, to truly exercise what's behind that API or that end IP, you may need to have to load up that mobile app to determine what is the underlying backend attack path. Now, is that still an external? If they're not giving me anything and the back end of that is configured in such a way to go ahead and be attacked the same way someone on the internet's going to be doing it as an adversary looking to try to attack the organization, it's still in fair play. So it's a delineation between the two of them. Is it a full-blown API test? I wouldn't call it a full-blown API test, but is it using an API test to show where their weaknesses are? Yes. It is showing it's showing that additional technique to dive deeper and to really add value to the client as you're going through that test.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So this last story for WebSockets, and this was a really interesting one. We were doing an IoT assessment for this medical device that allowed certain types of treatment that could be done via shock for different types of medical conditions. And the way it worked was the mobile app that the clinician would use and the patient would use would all communicate to the back end over WebSockets to a cloud-based service. Now, as we're digging into the WebSocket communication, we found a number of issues that were uncovered. First of which, we found that the clinician that would actually do the programming of this IoT device that you could imagine being finally strapped in and attached to a patient, allowed the ability to, by serial number, to send bad programming or bad, what we called in that case, it was patient therapies to other devices just based on the serial number. Now, the front end communication and the front end application that the clinician would use was designed to be limited on the serial numbers based on what was enrolled by their patients. But what we found was the underlying WebSockets didn't have those restrictions put in place. So we were, in essence, sending therapies to devices that, granted, this was all in the test environment, that we didn't own and we weren't in charge of. So in doing so, with these therapies, you could set certain variables, including the shock value that the therapies would do. We found that we can actually raise those values even higher, and you could see that someone that should be only getting, for example, a couple of millivolts of therapy, we can actually do raise the voltage up to single volt and multi-volt levels, which would be, completely detrimental to the patient that was getting that end therapy. So the organization saw it, they addressed the back-end communications, they were thrilled by it, but you can see if we didn't dive into those WebSockets, we wouldn't have seen that issue, we wouldn't have seen that misconfiguration in the authorization, and you could easily see how detrimental it could have been if this gotten, into the wild. So a lot of times people don't have that opportunity, or they haven't seen places where they can go ahead and dive deeper and have that firsthand experience of doing API security testing. I'm a big fan of OWASP just because they're kind of the forefront leader in doing a lot of web app security testing. They have a couple of different projects. Jouldjian is one of the ones I highly recommend for doing web app testing and also API testing. It teaches you as you go, but others do exist. DVWA, Damn Vulnerable Web App, WebGoat, and Multitude too. Once again, great tools to do. The tools are free. I mean, SoapUI, as I was mentioning before, a lot of traction there for the tools you're going to be seeing. And a lot of these tools you're going to be chaining together quite often, meaning you're going to proxy one to the other just to see how that communication is working, just to do those replay attacks and to do those various types of attacks against those backend APIs. So as I was mentioning, SoapUI and Burp Community Edition, they do all that communication, all the different types of attacks for against SOAP, against REST, and against WebSockets. Now the floor is open for any questions.
Do you have any good sources for learning more about this and continuing to educate ourselves on this?
No, definitely. And really the best one that's out there between OWASP, Jouldjian, and WebGoat, they're going to teach you as you're actually doing the various types of tests. They're going to show you what they are as you're going through them. I'm a huge fan of CTFs, but you're not going to see a lot of these types of web apps and APIs, especially as you're going through them. I haven't seen them historically. Also on top of that, I mean, as you're using mobile apps, as you're doing web apps, it doesn't hurt, to look at the communication. It's one thing to look, it's another thing to actually start attacking these things. So watching the back-end communication as you're surfing the web. I know a lot of web app testers that do that on the regular.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And finally, I want to say a special thanks to Rumham. Thanks for offering, for looking for speakers, and definitely appreciate the opportunity.